If you're ready for the next chapter of history, subscribe to the History Profile.
How is it possible that a man who swore the Hippocratic Oath, a man revered as a beloved family doctor and an unwavering pillar of his local community, could secretly betray that sacred trust to become one of the most prolific, cold-blooded, and systematic serial killers in modern history? This is not a tale of a shadowy figure lurking in the alleys. It is the deeply disturbing true story of Dr. Harold Shipman, a man who held the power of life and death in his hands and repeatedly callously chose death. The question that continues to haunt a nation is not just what he did, but how he managed to conceal his malevolence for decades behind a facade of compassionate medical care, visiting the homes of his patients not to heal, but to execute. In the unassuming town of Hyde, part of Greater Manchester, Dr. Harold Shipman was more than just a local GP. He was an institution. To his patients, he wasn't the formal Dr. Shipman, but rather the affable and approachable Fred. He cultivated an image of a traditional old-school general practitioner, the kind of doctor many believed had vanished in the modern age. He was seen as a man who genuinely cared, a doctor who didn't rush his appointments, and who still believed in the personal touch. This perception was especially strong among his elderly patients, many of whom lived alone and viewed his visits as a social comfort as much as a medical necessity. They adored him, trusting him implicitly, often praising his compassionate bedside manner and his willingness to make caring house calls, a practice that, in retrospect, provided him with the perfect isolated stage for his crimes. The psychological roots of this monstrous duality may lie buried deep in his formative years, specifically in a moment of profound childhood grief. As a young man, he was a devoted son, and he bore witness to the slow, agonizing decline of his mother, Vera, as she succumbed to terminal lung cancer. In her final days, her excruciating pain was managed and ultimately eased by the administration of morphine, delivered by a doctor in her own home. Young Harold watched this process intently. The central, haunting question that psychologists and criminologists have wrestled with ever since is this: did this deeply personal and tragic moment, watching the godlike power of a medical professional to alleviate suffering, to control pain, and to grant a peaceful end with a simple injection, create the lethal blueprint for the monster he would become? Harold Shipman was only 17 years old when his mother, Vera, passed away in June 1963. Her death from lung cancer was not sudden. It was a protracted ordeal that he observed with meticulous and unnerving focus. He had been his mother's primary caregiver, and he was present for the repeated visits from the family doctor who came to their home to administer doses of morphine. It was this specific act that captivated him. He was not merely saddened by her passing. He was fundamentally fascinated by the clinical power of the opiate. He saw how the morphine didn't just ease her physical suffering. It seemed to grant the attending doctor a profound, ultimate control over the very process of life and death. This observation, the link between medical authority and absolute power, appeared to imprint itself upon his young psyche. This dark fascination with opiates did not remain a passive psychological quirk. It metastasized into a personal and professional crisis. By 1975, Shipman was a practicing doctor, and his intimate knowledge of powerful drugs evolved into a full-blown addiction. He wasn't using morphine, but pethidine, a synthetic opioid, and his dependency became so severe that he began forging prescriptions to obtain the drug for his own personal use. This was not a minor indiscretion. It was a serious criminal act. When his fraudulent activities were finally discovered by his medical partners, he was caught, charged, and subsequently fined $600. He was forced to attend a drug rehabilitation clinic in York. In what would become a catastrophic failure of oversight, despite this clear evidence of drug abuse and professional misconduct, Harold Shipman was allowed to keep his medical license, a decision that would ultimately cost hundreds of lives. How does a predator of this magnitude manage to hunt, not in the shadows, but in the broad daylight of a trusting community, for decades? The answer is as simple as it is terrifying. He inverted the very concept of suspicion. He did not become an outcast. He became the epicenter of trust. Harold Shipman's hunting blind was his medical practice. He weaponized the societal trust placed in his profession, transforming the doctor's white coat into a cloak of invisibility. He became the one person no one, not his patients, not their families, not his colleagues, would ever or could ever bring themselves to suspect. His victims didn't just trust him. They were grateful for his attention, welcoming their killer into their homes with open arms. The next crucial step in refining his murderous methodology came in 1992. After leaving a group practice, Shipman established his own single-handed practice on Market Street in Hyde. This move was not merely a career progression, it was a strategic masterstroke for a serial killer. By definition, a single-handed practice meant he was the only doctor. He employed receptionists, but he had no medical partners, no associate doctors, and no practice nurses who might question his clinical decisions or review his patient files. This structure was his fortress of solitude. It eliminated the daily professional oversight and collegial scrutiny that exist in any normal medical environment. He had achieved, in effect, total unquestioned autonomy over his patients, his prescriptions, and his records. He was, in every sense, his own boss, and there was no one left to look over his shoulder. With his fortress established, his victim profile became chillingly consistent. His targets were not chosen at random. They were selected with the same clinical precision he applied to his medical records. They were, almost exclusively, elderly women, and a significant majority of them lived alone. These were women who had grown up in an era where the doctor's word was gospel. They were often isolated, with their families living far away, and they viewed Dr. Shipman as a figure of authority and comfort. They trusted him implicitly, not just with their health, but with their lives. They would welcome good old Dr. Fred into their sitting rooms, often putting the kettle on for a cup of tea, completely unaware that the man they admired was bringing his primary weapon, a syringe filled with poison, in his familiar black medical bag. For more than 2 decades, this system was flawless. He moved from his first practice in Todmorden to his locked-down surgery in Hyde, killing, falsifying, and signing, all while his reputation as a pillar of the community grew. He was, by all accounts, getting away with it, becoming more arrogant and more confident with every murder he committed. He had outsmarted his colleagues, the coroners, and the families of his victims. But then, after 20 years of meticulous, disciplined murder, a final act of astounding, inexplicable, and pure greed became the first catastrophic mistake that would lead to his unraveling. The victim who would bring him down was Kathleen Grundy, a vibrant, healthy, and wealthy 81-year-old woman, a former mayoress of Hyde. She was not a frail, bed-bound patient. She was active and sharp. On June 24, 1998, Shipman visited her home, administered a fatal dose of diamorphine, and signed her death certificate, citing old age. But this time, he didn't stop at just falsifying her medical records. In an act of breathtaking arrogance, Shipman decided to claim her estate. He sat down at his old manual typewriter and forged a new will. The document was amateurish, crude, and glaringly obvious. It was littered with spelling errors and looked nothing like her previous, professionally drafted will. The contents of this fraudulent document were as shocking as its execution was poor. The newly forged will completely cut out her own children and grandchildren, leaving her entire estate, valued at $386,000, to one person, her trusted physician, Dr. Harold Shipman. In this single greedy act, Shipman had finally crossed a line from invisible, godlike killing to tangible, traceable fraud. He had made a fatal underestimation. He had assumed the family would be too grief-stricken to question him. He had not, however, counted on the fact that Mrs. Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, was not just a grieving child. She was an intelligent and experienced lawyer who knew, with absolute certainty, that this will was a fabrication. While Angela Woodruff's suspicion was the catalyst for the final investigation, it was not the first time alarms had been raised. The question, how could one single doctor have so many dead patients, had been simmering beneath the surface in Hyde for some time. In fact, one of the very first non-medical warnings came from the man who had the grim task of burying the bodies. A local undertaker, reviewing his own books, had become deeply unsettled. He saw a statistical pattern that simply did not make sense. He was handling an abnormally high, a truly disproportionate spike in deaths, all originating from a single practice, Dr. Shipman's. This local undertaker, Alan Massey, noticed the alarming spike in deaths coming from Shipman's practice. It wasn't just the sheer number that concerned him. It was the characteristics of the deaths. His patients weren't just old. They were dying at an astonishing and unprecedented rate. Furthermore, he noted a disturbing pattern. Many of Shipman's deceased patients were discovered sitting in their chairs, often fully clothed, as if they had died suddenly and without warning in the middle of the afternoon. This was inconsistent with the typical profile of elderly patients passing away from protracted illness, who are more commonly found in bed. He discreetly shared his concerns, but they were initially dismissed as statistically insignificant. Simultaneously, alarms were being raised within the medical community itself. Another local GP, Dr. Susan Booth, based at a neighboring surgery, became concerned about the unusually high cremation rate among Shipman's patients. A high rate of cremation is a red flag for a killer, as it permanently destroys all toxicological evidence. Dr. Booth took her concerns to the coroner, and these, combined with the undertakers, sparked an early clandestine police investigation in March 1998, just 3 months before he killed Kathleen Grundy. Inexplicably, the investigation was utterly botched. The police, relying heavily on the very medical records Shipman had falsified, found no evidence to suggest any wrongdoing and summarily cleared him. This failure effectively gave Shipman a green light, and he would go on to kill 3 more patients. But the lawyer daughter, Angela Woodruff, was not an undertaker or a rival GP whose concerns could be brushed aside. She was the victim of a direct, tangible crime, fraud. She flatly refused to believe the forged will was legitimate. She knew her mother's signature. She knew her mother's intentions, and she knew that her mother would never have left her family's inheritance to her doctor in such a crude document. Her persistence, her professionalism, and her status as a lawyer provided the irrefutable evidence of a crime that the police could not ignore. This time, her complaint forced them to take the one investigative step that Harold Shipman, in all his arrogance, had never, ever expected. Angela Woodruff's focused and credible suspicions, centered on the fraudulent will, gave the police what they had previously lacked: probable cause for a serious investigation. The will was so clearly a fake that it cast an immediate shadow of doubt over the natural death that Shipman had certified. The police now had a reason to question everything. Acting on this new evidence, they took the extraordinary and decisive step of going to Kathleen Grundy's grave. In August 1998, nearly 2 months after her death, her body was exhumed. The one thing Shipman had always avoided by encouraging cremation had failed him in his most high-profile case. His victim's body was now evidence. The exhumation yielded the smoking gun that had been missing for 20 years. The toxicology report, conducted on the exhumed tissue samples, was definitive and conclusive. Kathleen Grundy's body contained high, unequivocally lethal levels of diamorphine, medical-grade heroin. This was not a drug that had been prescribed to her. She had no medical condition, such as terminal cancer, that would ever warrant its use. There was absolutely no medical reason for it to be in her system. The natural causes death, the old age certification signed by Dr. Shipman, was a demonstrable, scientific, and prosecutable lie. The serial killer's invisible armor had finally been pierced. With the physical evidence from Grundy's body, police launched a full-scale investigation, exhuming more bodies and finding the same pattern. Shipman was arrested and put on trial in October 1999, not for one murder, but for 15. Throughout the proceedings at Preston Crown Court, Shipman's demeanor was not that of a man broken, ashamed, or frightened. He was the opposite. He was cool, detached, and utterly arrogant, projecting an air of intellectual superiority. He sat in the dock, listening to the harrowing evidence, as if he were an inconvenienced academic, believing even then that he was smarter than the prosecutors, the judge, the jury, and everyone else in the room. In a high-risk gamble, Shipman chose to take the stand in his own defense, a decision that would prove to be disastrous for him. Rather than appearing human and empathetic, he was argumentative and disdainful. He provided convoluted, condescending, and often nonsensical scientific explanations for the presence of heroin in his patients. He attempted to blind the jury with complex medical jargon, suggesting that the toxicology results were anomalies, or that the patients may have been secret drug addicts. He obfuscated, he patronized, and he lied, but his explanations grew increasingly implausible. Crucially, he denied everything. He denied the murders, he denied the forgeries, and he denied any and all wrongdoing, painting himself as the victim of a tragic misunderstanding. Ultimately, it was Shipman's monumental arrogance that became his downfall, the very arrogance that led him to believe he was infallible. He had killed with a syringe and thought he had covered his tracks with a keyboard. He believed he could not only rewrite medical history, but that he could control time itself. He was wrong. While he was a master at manipulating people, he was an amateur at manipulating technology. He did not realize that his early computer system, which he had used to forge his alibis, was also keeping a secret diary. His computer, the very tool of his deception, told the unvarnished truth. The prosecution's computer experts had found the digital ghost hiding in his machine's hard drive. In the 1990s, medical record software was not as sophisticated as it is today. Shipman could delete and rewrite entries, but the system logged every single change with an uneditable automatic timestamp. These timestamps were the digital fingerprints he had left at the scene of every crime. The prosecution could now create a precise timeline, and the timestamps on the falsified medical records were utterly, indisputably damning. They proved, beyond any doubt, that his entire defense was a lie. The evidence was as clear as a confession. The computer's audit trail showed that Shipman had, for example, accessed Kathleen Grundy's file to write detailed notes about her worsening symptoms and frail condition at 5 p.m. on the day of her death. This would have been a plausible entry except for one problem. The police already knew that Shipman had been at her home and certified her death hours earlier. In case after case, the timestamps proved he was writing medical histories for patients after he had already killed them, sometimes even after he had officially signed their death certificates. His meticulously constructed digital alibi had completely collapsed, exposing the cold, calculated fraud underneath. On January 31, 2000, after a trial that had gripped and horrified the nation, the jury returned its verdict. They found Dr. Harold Shipman guilty on all 15 counts of murder. He was also found guilty on a separate charge of forgery for the crude will of Kathleen Grundy. The judge, Justice Forbes, handed down the only sentence possible for such monstrous crimes. Shipman was sentenced to 15 concurrent life sentences for the murders, plus a consecutive 4-year sentence for the forgery. The sheer scale of the sentence, one for every life he was proven to have taken in that courtroom, was a clear message of the judiciary's revulsion. In passing the sentence, Justice Forbes made a rare and powerful recommendation to the Home Secretary, stating that in his view, life should mean life. He recommended that Harold Shipman never be released from prison under any circumstances. Throughout this sentencing, and indeed throughout the entire trial, Shipman himself remained impassive, silent, and defiant. He offered no statement, no apology, and no explanation. He never confessed to the 15 murders he was convicted of, nor the hundreds of others he was suspected of. He never explained his motives, and to his last day, he never showed a single solitary trace of remorse for his actions. Harold Shipman's story did not end with a long, slow decline in prison. On January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, he was found dead in his cell at HMP Wakefield, a high-security prison. He had hanged himself using bed sheets, which he had tied to the window bars of his cell. His final act was as controlled and solitary as his murders. By taking his own life, Shipman ensured that the families of his victims would never get the answers they craved. He took all of his secrets, his motivations, and the true full scale of his depravity with him to the grave, a final act of control and contempt. The trial was over, the forger was convicted, and the killer was incarcerated. But for the public, and especially for the residents of Hyde, the true horror was only just beginning to be understood. The conviction for 15 murders felt like just the tip of a terrifying iceberg. A chilling, pervasive question settled over the entire community, and indeed the country. If he was caught for these 15, how many more were there? How many natural deaths over his 24-year career were not natural at all? The 15 victims were just the ones the prosecution could prove in court. The real investigation was about to begin. In response to this horrifying question and the massive public outcry, the government launched one of the most extensive public inquiries in British history, which became known as the Shipman Inquiry. It was a massive, multi-year undertaking, led by High Court Judge Dame Janet Smith. The inquiry's job was staggering in its scope and morbidity: to meticulously investigate every single death certificate that Harold Shipman had signed over the course of his entire 24-year medical career. This meant re-examining thousands of deaths, pulling records, and speaking to hundreds of grieving families who were suddenly forced to question the natural passing of their loved ones. After 2 years of painstaking work, Dame Janet Smith published her report. The final number was not 15. It was not 50. It was not even 100. The conclusion of the report was so shocking, so vast, that it was almost incomprehensible. The official inquiry, a sober, judicial, and evidence-based investigation, had confirmed that the trusted family doctor had murdered on a scale that dwarfed any other known killer in the country's history. The number shattered all expectations and confirmed the nation's worst fears. The inquiry's final report concluded, with legal and medical certainty, that Harold Shipman had killed at least 215 of his patients. This was the conservative, confirmed number. The report went on to state that the probable total, including cases where the evidence was strong but not absolutely definitive, was likely over 250. The victim profile established at the trial held true. A staggering 80% of his confirmed victims were elderly women, patients who had trusted him, confided in him, and welcomed him into their homes. His youngest confirmed victim was a 41-year-old man, proving that no one was truly safe. The inquiry also demolished the myth that he was some kind of angel of mercy, easing the suffering of the terminally ill. The investigation found that he didn't just kill the sick. In many cases, he murdered perfectly healthy patients. He killed for a multitude of chillingly mundane reasons, sometimes for convenience to clear a bed or an appointment slot, sometimes to claim an inheritance, as with Kathleen Grundy, and most often it seemed he killed for a pure godlike sense of power and control. Perhaps in the end, the simplest and most terrifying explanation is that he killed simply because he could, and because he enjoyed it. By this confirmed count, he is not just a monster. He is, by a staggering margin, history's most prolific serial killer. The revelations of the Shipman inquiry sent a shockwave of profound horror and disbelief through the entire nation. It was a collective trauma, a deep and personal betrayal that struck at the very heart of society's most sacred compacts. If you cannot trust your doctor, who can you trust? The case raised a deeply unsettling question, one that echoed in clinics and hospitals across the country. How can a nation ever truly, fully trust a doctor again? The trust that had been built over generations, the belief in the physician as a healer, was shattered in an instant by the actions of one man. The Shipman inquiry's legacy was not just a horrifying body count. It was a catalyst for massive systemic reform. The report exposed colossal failures at every level of the medical and legal establishment. As a direct result, the laws governing the entire process of death certification, which had allowed Shipman to sign off on his own murders, were completely rewritten. New, stringent procedures for cremation were introduced to ensure a second, independent doctor reviewed the case. The rules for monitoring and prescribing controlled drugs like diamorphine were fundamentally overhauled. It was a tacit admission that the entire system, the one designed to protect patients, had failed catastrophically. The legal changes were necessary, but they could not heal the deepest wound. Harold Shipman's true, dark legacy is not found in the revised law books or the new regulations. His true legacy is the permanent, intangible, and toxic damage he inflicted upon the sacred bond of trust between doctor and patient. He introduced a new, insidious fear into the medical consultation, a shadow of doubt that lingers in the back of the public's mind. This erosion of faith, this suspicion cast upon a profession dedicated to healing, is a profound wound in the British public psyche, a wound that, for many, persists to this very day.